All right, so we are going to work through Acts 22 and into Acts chapter 23 this morning. We have come a long way in the book of Acts, and we've still got a good 25% of the book to go, but we're going to cover that in a relatively short amount of time. We're going to pick up the pace rapidly here because the last quarter of the book is actually focused in on Paul's imprisonment and his journey not just to Jerusalem, but also all the way to Rome. And so the text reads more as kind of travel narrative and a lot of defense of the Apostle Paul. We're going to talk about that more this morning, but we're able to cover that material fairly quickly. And so we'll be wrapping up the book of Acts in early December, and then we'll be able to kind of look back on some of the things that we've learned before we move into the next series. And so I want to ask, if you would, to follow along. If you weren't here last week, just to kind of catch you up to speed on what's going on right now, Paul has been determined for a while now to get to the city of Jerusalem. And the reason he wants to do that is because he has taken up a collection from the Gentile churches of money to take to the Jerusalem church in order to help the brothers and sisters there. Number one, because they're in genuine need. And number two, because Paul's great desire is to build unity between these Gentile churches and the Jewish church in Jerusalem. And we'll talk more at the end of the lesson about why that's so important. But he's been warned by and through the Spirit that this will not be an easy journey for Paul, that there will be some challenges that await him, specifically that he will be apprehended. And what happens at the end of Acts chapter 20 that we talked about last week, Acts chapter 21, he gets to Jerusalem. And even though he tries very hard to be at peace with the people there, they see him, and because his reputation precedes him, people do not like Paul and the fact that he, in their mind, is attacking their very heritage as Israelites. And so a rumor begins to spread that he took a Gentile into the temple. When they see him in the temple, an uproar ensues, and things get so crazy that the Roman guards have to step in and basically save Paul from the mob. The people are so angry that they are determined to kill Paul. And so while they are busy beating him literally to death, the Roman guards step in and they arrest Paul to try to put an end to the situation and figure out who this man is and what he's done to cause this much fervor among the Jewish population in Jerusalem. But it gives Paul an opportunity to preach. And again, I asked you at the end of last week to just try to imagine this scene, this mob of people that are intent on killing Paul. Paul, who's just been beaten by the mob, and now he asks for an opportunity to turn and address the very crowd that just tried to kill him. So imagine him muddied and bloodied and bruised, and in that kind of state, wanting still to have an opportunity to preach the gospel to that group of people. So he's given that opportunity, and we find his speech recorded for us in Acts chapter 22. And this is what he says. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. And remember, it said he'd begun speaking in Aramaic. And so he got their attention by appealing to the fact that he's just like them. He's speaking in their native tongue. And it says when they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. So now they're willing to listen to what he has to say. Then Paul said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia and brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel. We were introduced to him earlier in the book of Acts, a very prominent teacher. And it says, and I was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way, referencing disciples of Jesus, to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus, and I went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. What he's sharing with them is information they knew. They knew the story of Paul. They were familiar with him, but he's just reminding them, I am one of you. This whole idea that I've come here to somehow upset you as Israelites and turn my back on my own people, that's just not true. That's not what Paul was trying to do at all. And so he reminds them, I was as zealous for the law as you are today. And what I was doing because I thought it was what God wanted me to do. So he reminds them of his history and the fact that he was on his way to Damascus to carry out those instructions from the Jewish higher authorities. They had given him authority to continue to persecute Christianity. But then he begins to retell what we already learned back in Acts chapter 9 when Paul was called by name by Christ on the road to Damascus. And what ensues is mostly a retelling of that story, but with a few details added. And I would encourage you this week, as you have time, to read this alongside Acts chapter 9 and see what new details emerge. But as he tells the story, he says, "About noon, as I came near to Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me, and I fell to the ground. And I heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. And the voice responded, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.' My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, "and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that you have been assigned to do.' My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. And a man named Ananias came to see me, and he was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there." Again, Paul wants them to know this is all part of this Jewish community that God was at work through. "He stood beside me and he said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, 'The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up,' and please pay attention to this, 'be baptized and wash away your sin,' calling on his name." When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw the Lord speaking to me, and he said, 'Quick, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me.' 'Lord,' I replied, 'these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him.'" In other words, his argument back to the Lord is, yeah, but if they should believe anybody, it's me, because they know who I am and how zealous I was for persecuting the way. "But the Lord said to me, 'Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" It's very interesting because they're giving him an audience up to this point. They're willing to listen to him tell his story. He got their attention by speaking to them in their native tongue, and he's talking to them about what has happened in the past. It's remarkable to me they're even willing to listen to him talk about Jesus and how Jesus called him to the very ministry that he's now participating in. But what they won't put up with is this last statement here. The idea that God had called him specifically to go far away to the Gentiles. And it said the crowd listened to Paul until he said that. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." A man who would suggest that God is taking the gospel to the Gentiles is worthy of only one thing. And what is it? It's death. And we find something at play here that humanity has still not outgrown in the 2,000 years since this took place. The idea that it's very easy for us as people to get it into our heads that God's salvation is something we deserve, but there's always another group of people who doesn't. There's someone out there, some group of people that we despise so much in our hearts that the idea that God's grace and mercy would be extended to them is repulsive to us. That is, until God gets a hold of us and breaks those barriers down within our own mind and our own heart. But this is not a unique phenomenon to the Israelite people 2,000 years ago. People still struggle with this today. Look at how many conflicts exist in our world today. Why do they exist? Because of this very same phenomenon. This idea that groups of people hate other groups of people, and the idea that salvation, or whatever it is, belongs to us and not to them. The world continues to be plagued by this idea that there's us and they're them, and God is on our side and he's not on their side. And this is what's plaguing them. So much so that the suggestion that Paul had been called by God to take God's word to the Gentiles meant that he was only worthy of one thing, and that was death. Kill this man. Get him out of our sight. He's not worthy to live. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, they're very worked up. The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks, and he directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. We got to beat this information out of him. There's only one way we're going to get to the truth. We got to beat it out of him. And they stretched him out to flog him. And as they're doing so, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." And the commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." And Paul's response was, "Yes, but I was born a citizen." Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. He had broken the law by doing that. And now he realizes what he was about to do, and he's scared of the repercussions. So this is how Paul begins his time in Jerusalem. Going there, not knowing what God has called him to, but knowing that he's going to face something serious, and it comes to fruition almost immediately. Even though he and James had worked together to try to appease the Jewish population, to show that he was not there to antagonize them in any way, it didn't work. They see him in the temple, they work themselves into an uproar, they try to beat him to death, and when he's saved by the Roman guards and is given an opportunity to preach to them, this reference to the Gentiles is all they can handle. And they want Paul dead. So now he's been apprehended by the Romans, and what I want you to see and understand is that from this point all the way to the very end of the book of Acts, Paul is a prisoner that entire time. It's a span that stretches several years, and Paul never gains his freedom. He will eventually, we know from other letters, but when the book of Acts ends, Paul is still a prisoner. So this is what the end of Paul's ministry looks like through the lens of the book of Acts. But now he's given an opportunity to preach in front of the Sanhedrin. So think of this as the highest authority for the Israelites in Jerusalem. So it says the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble, and he brought Paul and he had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and he said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." And at this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Just the suggestion that Paul had been following his conscience makes him worthy of getting hit in the face. And Paul said to him, pulling no punches, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. And those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" And people argue over Paul's response here. Some suggest that Paul really was unaware of who Ananias was, and he's genuinely apologetic. Some people see in the language here a sarcastic rebuttal to the high priest. And I'm not sure which it is, but this is what Paul says. "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin. And so Paul's aware of his surroundings. Some on the Sanhedrin were Pharisees, some were Sadducees, and we'll find out more about what divided them. But Paul sees an opportunity here to speak directly to the Pharisees in hopes that he might gain some sympathy from that group of people. And so this is what he says. He calls out to the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And when he said that, a fight breaks out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and all the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. And again, he's tapping into a part of humanity that remains consistent to this day. You put a group of people in a room, and I bet even in this room, there are issues that I could bring up that would divide us. Because some of you are certain about this being right, and some of you are certain about the opposite being right. That's how we're wired as people. And I don't think Paul was necessarily trying to divide the group here, but I think he is trying to gain some sympathy from the Pharisees. But what ensues is they just hear him reference the resurrection, and that's a fighting point for them. And so they start fighting amongst each other. And look at what happens next. It says, "There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously, 'We find nothing wrong with this man.'" That's all it took for him to be on their side. Now he's fine. We find nothing wrong with this man. They said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? Well, of course that's going to make the Sadducees furious. And it says the dispute became so violent. Understand this. This isn't just an argument. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. And the irony in all of this is that one of their accusations against Paul is that he's causing trouble. Well, who are the troublemakers now? Right? They're just fighting amongst themselves, and the commander's worried Paul's literally going to be killed as a result of that. So he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring them into the barracks. So Paul has an opportunity to speak and give a defense before the Sanhedrin, but it doesn't get very far. He gets one statement into his defense, and they end up turning on each other. The following night, the Lord stood near to Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." What's the point of that message? The idea that Paul's here for a reason. And there's a purpose to all of this. And God has something bigger in mind for Paul. And so take courage. This isn't the end of your story. I've got bigger plans for you. And then we find here, the rest of the text we're going to work through this morning, that actually a plot unfolds to put Paul to death. They are seriously intent on finding a way to put Paul to death. It sounds just like the plans they had made with Christ, doesn't it? That they had determined he was such an enemy and such a threat to their purposes that he must be put to death. And they've determined the same about Paul. So it says the next morning some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot, and they went to the chief priests and the elders, and they said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister, so Paul's nephew, happens to be there, and when he heard of the plot, he went into the barracks and he told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" And he said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So now the commander knows about the plot, and his job is not to make the Jewish people happy. It's to protect Paul, the Roman citizen, at all costs. And so we're going to pick up there next week in the text that follows and see what happens to Paul moving forward. But in reflecting on all of this, there's one really important question we have to wrestle with as we work from here through the end of the book of Acts. And it's this: why does Luke focus so much on defending Paul and his ministry? In the narrative that leads us to the end of the book of Acts, we find out about Paul's travels and all the places he gets to go. But the constant theme in this is we're continually given an opportunity to hear a defense of Paul in his ministry. Now you think about the book of Acts, it's 28 chapters long. And when we talk about the book of Acts, we always refer to it as a history of the early church, right? But 25% of the book of Acts is dedicated to just making a defense of one man in his ministry. How is that a part of early church history? Why did Luke feel it's so important to spend that much time and effort defending Paul in his ministry? Why not talk about all the other things that were going on in the Christian world at that point in time? Why is it so important for Luke to spend this much time defending Paul? In order to answer that question, I want to take you to two passages, one in Philippians and one in Ephesians. And the reason I want to do that is twofold. Number one, because it's Paul in his own words. Again, we get insight into what Paul's thinking. Number two is because both of these letters are a part of what we call the prison epistles. In other words, these are letters written by Paul when he is in prison. And more likely than not, these were written by Paul during his time in Rome, when he's in prison in Rome at the very end of the book of Acts. And so this is as Paul is reflecting on everything that we're reading about now, in the years that lead up to the end of the book of Acts, as Paul spends so much time in prison in one place or another defending himself, as he's reflecting on that, still in prison, by the way, this is what he writes. So as you think about this question, why did Luke spend so much time talking about this? Think about this passage, Philippians chapter 1, if you turn over there with me, please. Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 12, Paul writes this. He says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, now what has happened to him? He's in prison in Rome. He's reflecting back on everything we're reading about now. All the stuff that goes from Acts 21 to Acts 28. He says, I want you to know that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And that's the first reason why I think Luke spends so much time talking about this. When you reflect upon everything God has done through Paul, you come to the overwhelming conclusion that this isn't really a biography of Paul at all. It's a story about how God was at work through Paul. And I cannot stress that enough. We're not supposed to read the book of Acts and make Paul a hero. We're supposed to read the book of Acts and understand how God was at work through someone even like Paul. When we're introduced to Paul earlier in Acts, what is he doing? Persecuting Christians, in his own words, to the death. Yet Paul took that man, or God took that man and converted him to something entirely different. To someone who was willing to go to prison for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is all about the work that God did through Paul. And regardless of what Paul's doing, God is at work through him. Keep that in mind. Whether Paul is freely traveling through the Greek-speaking world spreading the gospel, or whether he's here in chains, or going all the way back to the beginning, when Paul is literally trying to put Christians to death and commit them to prison, regardless of what he's doing, God is at work through him. If you go all the way back to when Paul began that persecution in Jerusalem, beginning with the stoning of Stephen, God used that as a way to grow the church. So regardless of what Paul's doing, God is at work through him in order to accomplish his will. And I think Luke wants us to see that loud and clear. That even though Paul is going to spend all this time in jail, God is still using him to further the gospel message. And so that's what he says here. I want you to know that what's happened to me has actually caused the gospel to be advanced. As a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. How has this impacted the church at large? Well, the same thing continues to happen. What have we seen so far? The more the church gets persecuted, the more what? The more it grows. Regardless of which one of the apostles is arrested or beaten or threatened or even killed, what happens to the church? It continues to grow. And the same is happening here. Paul says this remarkable thing happened. I got put in jail, and yet the church continues to grow. And actually, you guys, all these churches that know about my imprisonment, he says, you've become even more bold in your preaching because you see how God is at work through me. It's a remarkable thing. This has been a theme throughout the book of Acts, isn't it? That God is working in ways that we never would have imagined. And yet he continues to work. And I just want you to continue to reflect on that in the book of Acts and apply it to our present day situation. We have got an idea, very specific ideas about how and when and where and why God is supposed to act. And yet, regardless of what happens, he continues to work in surprising ways. Not because of all the things we do, but because God's kingdom is not going to be silenced, and no one is going to come between God and the fulfillment of his will, ever, period. This is what Jesus said to Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. You cannot get in the way of God. He's going to overcome whatever. So he says in verse 15, he says, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Then he says this famous thing, for to me, to live is Christ. You remember what he said after that? To die is gain. This is the perspective Paul has. Even in jail, God is at work through him. And so why does Luke spend so much time talking about Paul's imprisonment? Why not just skip to the end of that whole story and say, hey, but he got out of jail and he continued to work? Because he wants us to see that even in prison, God is doing something through Paul. So if you ever find yourself in a position in life where you're thinking, my situation prevents God from being at work through me, think again. Because no such situation exists. God can be at work through you no matter what, as he was through Paul. So that's the first thing I want you to think about. And the second is this, Ephesians chapter 2, if you turn over there. So again, Paul writes from prison, Ephesians chapter 2. And what I want you to think about just quickly here as we bring this to an end is that Paul is on trial. Paul's the one who's been arrested. Paul's the one who's giving a defense, but it's not a defense of himself that matters most to Paul. It's a defense of the ministry that he's been called to. What's at stake in all of this isn't just Paul being arrested and being silenced. It's that the gospel that Paul is standing for, the gospel to which he's been called to, the ministry to which he's been called to, might be questioned in some way. That its legitimacy might be called into question, and Paul will not stand for that. He needs people to know, and Luke does as he writes the book of Acts, that Paul was indeed called for this purpose, specifically to take the gospel to what group of people? To the Gentiles. That's what's at stake here. That people understand what God is doing through Paul in this message that has made these Israelites in Jerusalem so mad at this very point in history, that God is indeed calling the Gentiles back to himself. For the Jews, that's important because they need to understand that this is all fulfilling the promises God made to Abraham at the very beginning. That he would turn Abraham into a great nation, but that through Abraham what? All the nations of the earth would be blessed. The Israelites need to know that through Jesus, the Messiah, the Gentiles are being welcomed into the fold of God, and that's all according to God's plan. They need to know that. But likewise, the Gentiles need to know that they've been invited into God's family, not to the exclusion of the Israelites. That they've been grafted in to those groups of that group of people, those Israelites, those descendants from Abraham that have been given all those promises. God is not turning his back on the promises he made to the Israelite people. He is fulfilling every one of those promises, and that's happening through Jesus. And Paul has been called to help the Gentile people know what that looks like. And the Israelites need to accept all of that as being part of God's plan. That's what's at stake here. Is that people understand that this is all genuinely part of God's plan. And so let me just read you Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Paul writes, "Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth, and called uncircumcised by those who are called the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier by dividing the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace." What's at stake here is that both the Israelites and the Gentiles lose sight of that reality. He came and he preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near, for through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. This is what God is doing, and he called Paul specifically to take that message to the Gentiles. The reason Luke spends so much time talking about this is because we simply cannot understand how God fulfilled his promises to the Israelites, and we cannot understand what God has in mind for the Gentiles if we don't listen to the preaching of Paul. Because that's what Paul was called to explain to us, these mysteries of God as they unfold in the gospel of Jesus the Christ. We take for granted today, I think, how beautiful it is to be able to worship in a place where we have people from all different parts of the world, from different ethnic backgrounds, speaking different languages, people from different countries all over the world that bring different cultural backgrounds together. And we get to gather together and raise one voice to our God. We just take for granted that that's the way it's supposed to be. But this world is still plagued by this idea that there are those of us who deserve the gospel and those who don't. And until we completely let go of that and allow the gospel that Paul preached to permeate us completely so that there are no more dividing walls and no more barriers. I've told you before, Christ came to tear the barriers down, to tear those dividing walls down, and we're right behind him, building them back up as quickly as we can sometimes. The message of Paul is so vital to our understanding of the gospel. And so if you're wondering why Luke spends so much time and why we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about all of this stuff Paul had to go through while he's in prison, thinking, well, what can you possibly do in jail? Well, pay attention. Because God continues to do some very powerful things through Paul in spite of the fact that he's in chains. Because you cannot stop the gospel. You can't. And you can't chain the message of the grace of Jesus Christ. So with that, the lesson is yours. Will you stand with me and sing this final song together as we think about what God is calling us to do this week and how we might feel more bold because of what Paul was able to do as we take that gospel to the people around us. Let's stand and sing.
Sweet are the promises, kind is the word, dearer far than any message man ever heard. Pure was the mind of Christ, sinless I see. He the great example is and pattern for me. Where he leads I'll follow, where he leads I'll follow. Follow all the way, yes, follow all the way. Where he leads I'll follow, where he leads I'll follow. Follow Jesus every day. Sweet is the tender love Jesus has shown, sweeter far than any love that mortals have known. Kind to the erring one, faithful is he. He the great example is and pattern for me. Where he leads I'll follow, where he leads I'll follow. Follow all the way, yes, follow all the way. Where he leads I'll follow, where he leads I'll follow. Follow Jesus every day. List to his loving words, come unto me. Weary, heavy laden, there is sweet rest for thee. Trust in his promises, faithful and sure. Lean upon the Savior and thy soul is secure. Where he leads I'll follow,